welcome to the first webinar in a series of 5 for Elemental on indoor air quality, IAQ, heating, cooling, health and well-being in the built environment. My name is Jim McClelland. I'm founder and editor of SustMeme, home to both the magazine and the top 500 rankings. Today, the topic of our opening session will be the scenarios and challenges of getting back to work in a post-pandemic world. We'll be discussing strategies and practicalities for satisfying new and exceptional requirements around indoor air quality and ventilation in the workplace, not least with commercial premises that have lain almost dormant during lockdown. Beyond this initial reboot phase, we'll also be considering ongoing sustainability from monitoring and management to future-proofing, resilience, economic drivers, design and engineering, digital tech and data. The whole webinar series is being hosted and produced by Elemental, www.elementalexpo.com, the online community for professionals focused on innovation in heat, water, air and energy, the vital elements within the built environment now and in the future. You'll find the full diary of events on the website, including the next 4 webinars in the series on indoor climate emergency, air tightness and ventilation, well-being, and finally, bringing us round full circle again, health. With some great speakers to come, starting with the 3 joining me on screen here today, namely Nick Jones, Head of Property Management at Grosvenor, UK and Ireland, Douglas Bucker, Co-founder and CEO, National Air Quality Testing Services, based at Lancaster University Environment Centre, and Curtis Gubb, Environmental Consultant and IAQ Specialist on the Sustainability Team at Cundall. By way of a very brief intro, I'd just like to say a little something about context. The debate around the post-COVID environment and indoor air quality is not taking place in a vacuum in any sense of the word. The built environment sector was already being asked to address the user experience and expectations in terms of indoor climate, health, well-being, including air quality, whilst at the same time pursuing a decarbonisation agenda as regards heating, cooling, ventilation and aircon. We increasingly understand the effects of good or bad indoor environments on, say, workforce productivity, children's attention spans, healthcare patient recovery rates, and all our sleep patterns. These issues have not gone away. They're still factors and will continue to be so post-COVID. If you add into the mix 40,000 excess deaths in the UK due to poor outdoor air quality and pollution every year, there was a debate to be had and a case to answer long before we even knew COVID existed. So let's zoom in on the issues, and I'll now like to bring in our panel. So as the UK seesaws in and out of local restrictions and workplaces open back up post-national lockdown, I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves and give us their take on the state of play with coronavirus, IAQ, health and wellbeing at present. So briefly, it's who are you, where do you fit into the puzzle, what's your view on the back to work challenge? So first, from a property management perspective, Nick.
Hi, thanks Jim. Nick Jones here. I work for Grosvenor, Britain and Ireland, and principally I'm responsible for managing all properties in the estate for Grosvenor's 300 acres of prime central London. We have a mixed use portfolio of about 2,500 properties covering residential, retail, office, hotel and a few other bits. And we run an estate, and what we try and do is our aim is to make our estate a great place for people to live and work and visit, and that's what we want to do, and that's especially true for for the current COVID crisis that we're in, and that presents us with some quite considerable challenges, of which we've had some successes and certainly we've learned a lot. So I'm here really to talk about it from a landlord and estate manager point of view, and for us, what we want to see is a healthy, vibrant place for people to live and work.
Excellent, thank you, Nick. And Curtis, as an environmental consultant, and I think you have a background as a chemist.
That's true, yes. So my initial degree was actually in chemistry, but I recently completed a PhD at the University of Birmingham that was looking at indoor air quality. So in terms of myself, I'm an environmental consultant at Cundall. I'm also a member of the SIBC Air Quality Working Group and the Knowledge Generation Panel. And what we really do, I really have quite a big focus on health and well-being. That's really my main role at Cundall, and we have a large focus on that ourselves. So that includes IEQ as a chunk of that, but also health and materials, so ensuring that the materials of the building or materials of a project are not detrimentally affecting the IEQ, and also post-occupancy evaluation and things like that as well. So that's where my background is from.
Excellent, thanks. And Douglas, as an ecopreneur and researcher.
Thanks for the introduction, Jim. I have to say I wasn't familiar with the phrase ecopreneur, but I think I'll start using that from now on. So I run a company called NAQTS, that's National Air Quality Testing Services. And it's a business I set up to raise awareness about indoor air quality in public and private buildings. And we primarily wanted to do that through the development of integrated and holistic measurement tools. As you'll see over my left shoulder is the sort of technology that we create. We try and take some of the learning that we do from our collaborations with Lancaster University and other universities around the world to put them into measurement devices that can provide valuable streams of data that are scientifically validated and also don't look like a piece of scientific equipment when you're putting it in an office space or a school. It's designed to look like a speaker. And thinking about where we fit into the puzzle, re COVID, really we think we can provide quite a valuable role in providing reliable information to help the opening up of workplaces and other buildings. And with the back to work challenge, I think it's all going to be about managing the dichotomies between ventilation and filtration to make sure we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater and having far greater ventilation rates than are needed.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you all. And Doug, that segues nicely into perhaps the first issues we're going to consider. And initially we're looking at risk, and to get a handle on risk, I'd like to break it down into two time frames. The first is the short term, the immediate, as regards reopening workplaces and readmitting occupants. The second then is more medium to long term, and that includes a range of issues such as ongoing monitoring, maintenance, mitigation, maybe crisis management, ultimately future proofing for years ahead. So first, in terms of the right now, the short term and the immediate risk, Curtis, what are the initial hurdles you see as needing to overcome?
So I think the initial hurdle certainly is how do we get everyone back to the office, and how do we get everyone feeling safe and reassured to actually go back to the office. And I think IEQ especially can play a big part in that. Monitoring the indoor spaces, presenting it to occupants on screens, for example, it can really help reassure people and make people sure that people are actually looking at the building, looking at the air quality. And as we all know, ventilation is really the key here, and many of the guidance bodies, SIBC, REVA, ASHRAE, they're really suggesting that, and many of the experts in academia as well, that ventilation is really the key. And having at least 10 litres per second per person, or if not up to BCO standards in the space, is really important to help dilute pollutants, but also any viruses alike. And that's really the best thing we can do. Now, in terms of how we do that, continuous monitoring with IEQ sensors is probably one of the best, well, one of the easiest ways and relatively cost-effective ways to monitor our spaces, monitoring the CO2 concentrations to ensure that enough ventilation is getting into the space. I think is really important, and we do that at Cundall throughout all of our offices, and we do that for various clients as well. And I think that what we find is monitoring that. It gives the occupants that reassurance we hope to come back alongside all the other aspects that we have in terms of cleaning requirements and everything else that's been spoken of a lot. But in terms of IQ, I think that is the key, and having that continuous monitoring, I think, is really important and the first step to getting people back in the offices.
Excellent. I think those kind of perception and confidence issues we'll definitely return to. And I guess some of what you're describing is very much the classic business idiom of to manage it first, you have to measure it. So in that regard, Douglas, where does investment in actual new kit fit into this?
Well, I completely agree with the last point you just made there, Jim. You can't improve what you can't measure. And I think it's really quite critical as the evidence for potential airborne virus transmission is growing. You know, it's certainly more established than it was back in March when it started to become a really serious crisis. That getting the right ventilation rates is going to be really important. And I think it's important that we are taking these measurements in the real world to know what is actually happening. Of course, from an industry perspective or a scientific perspective, that's going to be really valuable. But as Curtis said, I think being able to see this real-time data on the dashboard showing what potential risks are is going to be a really welcome step for building occupants to feel safe and comfortable about coming back into buildings. So I don't really see it so much as investment in new kit, but it's more the provision of a new service.
Excellent. And obviously, Nick, we're talking about the buildings, the data, the kit, but of course, it's about the people going back into them. So what are the kinds of conversations you're having, plans you're making with your clients, tenants, occupiers? If you could tell us a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, sure. So I think, I mean, from our perspective, we manage about 1 million square feet of office in across the West End. And, you know, we've been measuring, as well as talking to our customers, we've been measuring the sort of office occupancy. And, you know, in the first couple of weeks of September, we probably got up to about 25% pre-COVID occupancy. And that was, you know, broadly consistent with, you know, with other large office landlords and investors in London. And I mean, it's worth pointing out that actually, even very quickly after the lockdown lifted in sort of May, we were already seeing a trickle of sort of 5% or so of people coming into offices, and that sort of gradually rose, dropped a little bit over the summer holiday period, and then rose again. Now, of course, it has dropped in the last couple of weeks following recent government announcements and restrictions, although the expectation is that that will, you know, it will settle and increase again, obviously subject to whatever may happen with the with COVID cases and potential government restrictions. So we are seeing you know, hopefully a positive picture of people returning. But I think for me, there's two key aspects to this, and I think, you know, Curtis, you probably touched on the key one, which is around sort of encouraging people and demonstrating to people that actually the building is safe. And to me, that's actually the hardest thing to do, because, you know, you've got a lot of people who, you know, perhaps have been, you know, during working from home, or they may have been furloughed, you know, who have built a level of sort of safety in their own environment. So to ask them to, you know, journey to work in whatever way that might be, and then actually come to work is quite challenging. And I think that's the thing that we've had on our clients have been most concerned about. The other and ways that we can do that, I think, is definitely worthy of discussion. There are, of course, a whole host of building measures that can happen and should happen around physical measures to allow signage and signage for one-way systems and numbers in lifts. You know, maybe temperature checks at door entrances. Obviously, hand sanitizer, you know, everywhere you look, all of this kind of stuff. And so that's all really good stuff to happen. But actually helping to you know, really demonstrate to people that it is safe is something I think that's really important.
Sure. And can I just ask, obviously, the number of cases and the spikes are a consideration, but there is the economic issue, and of course the government's initial furlough scheme comes to an end, as it were, at the end of this month. Are you anticipating that you'll know a lot more about ongoing occupancy levels after the end of this first furlough session?
In theory, yes. Although I think one of the things that, well, certainly I've realised over the last few months is that every prediction I've made has been wrong. So I would certainly caveat things with that. But I mean, prior to 2 weeks ago, I think we were fairly optimistic of seeing about a 50% return by Christmas. Right. I think that might be now a little bit ambitious, but but as I say, anything can really happen with that. And in many ways, whilst that is important to many, and especially those people who depend on office workers,
Yep.
actually from the provider of office space, it actually doesn't matter whether you've got 40%, 60%.
Sure.
You want to create a safe place to work, and one that encourages people to come back, so that when they are when it's appropriate for them to do so, they feel comfortable and able to do so.
Perfect. And in terms of predictions, I mean, the next question I was really wanting to ask you to consider is rolling the clock and the calendar forward a bit, what we should expect in the medium to long term. So there are a lot more issues potentially in play. There might be ongoing monitoring, maintenance, mitigation, maybe crisis management if you have issues either nationally, regionally, or specifically within a building. Also training, behavior change, these maybe longer term cultural changes and trends in workplace culture. So ultimately then the crystal ball out, keeping people safe and healthy, and even the prospects for future-proofing assets and investment portfolios and business. So all these kind of issues in the longer term, I'm asking you to do a lot of thinking here in terms of how it plays out. But Curtis, how should built environment clients strategize for these longer timeframes, and what design and engineering skills might be needed?
Yeah, so in terms of Cundall itself, it's quite it's a very global company. We've got offices across the world, and we've had offices who've been through this before, in terms of the first SARS in Hong Kong and Shanghai. And the main things that they've kept on are public health measures, and that is extra cleaning regimes, keep it antimicrobial processes, everything like that in the doors, but actual engineered solutions that are sort of quite changing, quite energy intensive, haven't been kept. As long as the ventilation is kept to an adequate amount, and that again, as I mentioned before, as long as it's aligning with, say, best practice and BCO, and you're continuing to monitor it with IEQ sensors, then wholesale engineering changes haven't been carried forward. And again, that's a really good thing, I think, because in terms of the built environment, there's always this balance between health and well-being and energy, and with net zero carbon ever coming forwards, ever emerging on the landscape, that we can't sacrifice everything for that to improve the health and well-being. There's got to be a balance struck between the two, and I think from other offices, that's really what we've seen.
Excellent, and interesting, to some reassuring precedents there from elsewhere around the world. And Nick, in terms of how the markets, property markets, will recover and restore confidence, perhaps commercially, how will the property sector adapt and evolve over this ongoing time frame?
Thanks, Jim. And I mean, it's a really good question, and I think it's worth noting that a number of these trends that we're seeing are not new. They've simply just been accelerated massively by COVID. So the idea of a greater amount of flexible working, that was a trend that was already in play and will continue to be in play. The idea that an office is not banks and banks of desks that people come to like a factory, and then between 8 and 5. Actually, an office is far more a place to collaborate, to learn, to innovate, to socialize. And actually, it's a place that people want to go to do those things. And if they then need to focus on writing a report or doing some analysis, well, actually they can do that at home. So I think those trends were already in play, albeit, as I say, they've now massively accelerated. And so for me, I think investors and owners and landlords of offices are looking at ways to make sure their offices remain relevant for their clients, and then offer them this space for staff to want to come to, and and actually want to go there as to do high quality work that can't necessarily be done at home. And that to me is absolutely going to require innovation, agility, technology, and crucially, key engagement with those occupiers to understand what it is they want and how offices can meet those needs.
Excellent. Yeah, so there's a real dialogue to be had with current and prospective tenants, I guess, in terms of changes in demand and changes in emphasis. And Douglas, I've got kind of two questions for you, perhaps in this longer time frame. The first is kind of how can digital tech and data maybe help us? And the second, I know you have a background also in pollution and outdoor air quality issues. I was wondering if you'd also comment on perhaps how we might begin to value air quality more holistically in terms of indoor and outdoor, and put more value on the air we breathe in every respect. So firstly, digital tech and data, and secondly, that broader holistic, what's the value of air question.
Sure. So on the digital tech and data, I think this is going to play a really significant role in terms of the monitoring that we do in the medium term. I think the task for building operators is going to become a bit more complicated as we move in towards the colder months, where the engineering-based advice to set demand control ventilation to the same CO2 concentrations we see as outside is probably not going to be feasible given our net zero climate targets. And I think some of the shift is going to move towards the role that filtration can play. And that's going to require measuring a set of different pollutants. So, we're going to be wanting to look at what is the real world continuous effectiveness of HEPA filters, for example, and there are a plethora of other different filtration technologies. And this is, as I said, going to require a different stream of data, in this case particulates, which can then be displayed to the building occupants to provide that comfort. So it's going to be managing this trade-off between what is enough ventilation and what level of filtration do we need in these rooms, whether that is filtration in the HVAC system or portable air purifiers. Thinking about how this is going to change values, to put it bluntly, I think if an airborne, a virus which is having really significant airborne transmission in indoor environments, if that isn't going to change the way we think about indoor air quality, quite frankly, I don't know what will. I really see this as being a bit of a catalyst for us realizing that the air that we breathe indoors, where we spend more than 90% of our time, is going to have a significant effect on our health. Mm-hmm. When we start thinking about that in terms of outdoor air quality as well, of course, what is outdoors does come in, doesn't bounce off of the front door or the window. So it's really important to us be thinking about what role the building can play in both protecting against outdoor air pollution coming in, but also in terms of how it can be mitigating indoor sources, whether that is from activities or building furnishings and materials.
Excellent. And if I could ask you one extra little question, obviously you're based up there at Lancaster Uni. Construction, the built environment property hasn't got a great track record of collaborating extensively with academia, with research, not in the same way as say pharmaceuticals or other major sectors do. Do you think there's likely to be a closer synergy going forward, as maybe in terms of indoor environments, we understand there's more reliance on the science, or do you think that's optimistic?
No, I think that's a good way to put it, that I think there is going to be further collaboration, and I think that's because the economic incentives are going to be in the right places. Large property owners want to start getting people in their buildings. They're going to be wanting to take these measurements to make sure people feel safe to come back to work. And it's the same data, it's the same information which is going to be provided for air quality. We're measuring the same things. So I think that can really kickstart air quality being a more serious part about how we understand the built environment.
Excellent, thanks. And then, so moving forward then, we've looked, understandably, it's a global pandemic, historic proportions, the focus is on the problem, on the risk. However, without in any way understating the threat or downplaying the economic disruption or human tragedy, the flip side to that risk is obviously opportunity. All change brings opportunity. So as we move perhaps to some final takeaways, I wanted to ask you each what you see as potential positives and lessons to come out of COVID-19, obviously helping us build back greener and better. So Douglas, how can we be smarter off the back of COVID?
So I think Nick explained this really well earlier when thinking about what is the office for. it seems pretty clear to me that in the future, we're not going to be needing to go to the office every day. So we can really focus on making sure that offices are places of collective learning, collaboration, innovation, but not necessarily where you need to be between the hours of 8 and 5, as was said, no matter what. So I think that's a real lesson that we can learn from this crisis. I think another lesson is that, unfortunately, this isn't going to be the last pandemic. There probably will be some in the future. It's a case of when, not if. It could be another 100 years. But even if we're not thinking that nihilistically, we have flu outbreaks every year, lots of other sorts of viral transmissions that we don't have to be thinking about in pandemic terms to think that by providing a clean and healthy indoor environment, as a business operator, we could reduce our costs of potential sick employees and lots of other things. So I think the real key point is that this has hammered home that the indoor environment is very important for our health and well-being, not just in terms of pandemics, but also in terms of our mental health, and there's a lot we can learn from that.
Excellent. So potential changes in terms of workplace culture, but also in terms of ongoing workplace and public health, building in resilience as part of any sustainability strategy, facing potential repeats or other kind of pandemic scenarios as we go forward. Curtis, where do you see we can improve understanding and knowing what we now think we know?
Yeah, well, certainly I think we can future-proof buildings much better for this sort of occurrence. Can certainly build back more prepared, keep some of the measures in place where we can that we have now. And I think this is going to really, things like at the moment we're in a period of physical and social distancing inside, and things like that realistically aren't going to be able to last for a long period of time. So it's really about how can we make the spaces healthier in the first place. And as I touched on before, it really is, it's ensuring that ventilation and as Doug mentioned, the filtration is adequate. And everything along that in terms of health and well-being for both of our sort of our physical and our mental health. And in terms of in health and well-being, there's many things we can do with the space. And I think again, as Doug touched on, the office is going to change. It will be more a place for collaboration, more for a place that people come in maybe for only a couple hours a day, at certain periods a week, not for a place to necessarily do long periods of work. And I think that will change how we can design spaces. When we look at things like the well building standard and the new sort of health safety rating they've brought out, they all align with this, having enough space for collaborative places, for breakout spaces, but also to really consider all of the materials that go into the building and make sure that as where possible, things like copper, which is shown to be much more antibacterial, antimicrobial, are used where possible, and just smaller things like that. So then if this happens again, we've got more things in place. And as you mentioned before, crisis management, really, we'll have policies in if someone's ill, if we have to close the building, and how we can re-enter safely and hopefully quicker than is happening now.
Excellent. And that's very much looking at designing spaces for collaborative working and also collective well-being. And as soon as you start thinking like that, you're necessarily thinking about sustainability in the round, because the whole is much greater than the sum of the parts. And that's where we get some multiplier effects, which can be really dynamic in terms of creating attractive spaces to live and work. And last words from you, Nick, in terms of what are the lessons here that you would offer as takeaways at this point?
Sure, thanks, Jim. Well, certainly I would agree with what Doug and Curtis have said. And I think I read a report, and I'm sure there'll be many more to come, looking at office productivity over the last few months. And the report I read sort of talked about productivity being down about maybe 17% to about 2% up, depending on different factors, but overall not where businesses want it to be. And so for me, there's an absolute desire for office-based businesses to want to have an office space that helps to drive productivity for their teams. And that means that those occupiers, landlords, are fully aligned on trying to achieve this. So we need a dialogue together, and we need to work together to ensure that we can offer space that works for them. Clearly, there are some pretty impressive sort of well-being and happiness benefits to be able to work from home, most of the time, that is. And how we can bring those into the office environment is really key. And I think air quality is such an important part of that. So I think things that we've talked about in today's topic around how we can deal with that in a smart way, to make sure that we're not just ramping up our energy bills by turning up the ventilation system to full. How we can smartly adapt our systems to measure what's happening in the building, the number of people in the building, and adjust plant and equipment to respond to that. And then going back to the point that Curtis raised at the start is, how do we display this to the people using that office to help them feel engaged and safe, and that to reinforce the message that the office environment, all aspects of it, but in particular air quality, is a great place to be. Excellent.
And I think a couple of key words you used earlier in the discussion were kind of flexibility and agility, because of course this is an evolving situation. I think even if you look at the attitude and even the mental health of individuals working from home, you've seen fatigue in some cases creep in, and people hitting the wall. The novelty wore off, and their attitudes and perceptions have changed. So in terms of going forward, there'll be organizations will be evolving and changing, individuals in terms of their personal lifestyle, but also project teams. So potentially this flexibility and agility to be able to accommodate different phases, different times, and different requirements. And I think altogether, in a sense, we started at the top of the discussion, if you like, talking about back to work. And I think really maybe the phrase we should be talking about is back to the future of work, because I think in some respects that is actually what we're talking about, which is a much broader social sustainability and economic and environmental sustainability question. So in closing, a big thank you then to all my panelists, Nick, Doug and Curtis. A reminder to check out Elemental, www.elementalexpo.com, the online community for professionals focused on innovation in heat, water, air and energy. You'll find the full diary of events on the website, including the 4 webinars coming up in the series, plus many others besides, running between now and the physical show, which takes place, the Elemental Expo itself, Excel London, in about a year's time, 29th to 30th September 2021. So all it remains for me to do is say thank you very much to my guests. That's it. I've been Jim McClelland, editor at SustMeme. Thanks for watching, and see you again soon. Thank you very much.